Hey everybody, welcome back to Rain and Pours. I'm Mitch and I'm doing a bit of a different video today. I am making my own framed wood panel. So I've got here some lengths of 42mm pine lengths, and these are 1.2 meter lengths I believe I got. And I'm going to make my frame 800mm by 800mm wide. So it's going to be a square, and this is the base for my Pride collab piece. So the Pride collab will probably be out before this video, so if you want to see what I make with it, go and watch that one. And what I'm doing here is I've measured in from the ends of each piece of wood 800mm, which is 80 centimeters, and I have used the piece of wood to mark in from that 42mm, because I'm going to overlap these with a butt joint, and that means that to get 800mm squared, you have to take into the account that you've got, the piece of wood butting up to the edge. So you'll see what I mean when we assemble the frame. So I'm just using my jigsaw, and I've got a set square which I've clamped to the pieces of wood, and I'm doing both at the same time, making a nice straight clean cut all the way through. So now I'm just measuring to make sure that I've got exactly 80 centimeters, and I did. So I was very proud of myself. Measure twice, cut once, and I did notice that my measurements weren't exactly 100% equal on this piece, so I went back, I remeasured. Always measure twice before you cut, because once you've cut it, you can't reassemble it, and that will mean that your canvas or your panel isn't the right size. Now I also do have the pieces of wood very close to the edge of my table here, and watching it back I can see it's just a little bit too close for comfort, but this table is sacrificial. I can change out that piece of plywood at any time. Now, when you're cutting a piece off and that piece is the length you're going to use, you cut on the outside of the line. In this case, the pieces that I was going to save were the ones on the table, so I cut on the inside of the line. And it's kind of hard to explain, but you need to account for the width of the saw blade when you do that. So always cut on the opposite side so that the piece you're working on falls away and you're left with that perfectly aligned and lengthened piece of wood. So now I've got my pieces on the bench, and I do need a bigger bench for this, and I'm just using a staple gun to put 2 staples in the front and 1 on the back, and that's going to hold that frame nice and rigid while we work with it. And always remember to take off your stickers or put them facing down the direction that you're going to nail your other board onto. So it's as simple as flipping it over, adding a staple to each side. It doesn't really matter how you do this. I went with staples this time. There are so many other ways to do it. A pin nailer will work really well to getting the top bit nailed down. I did have some trouble with the staples protruding from the surface of the plywood board, which we'll get to in just a second. So I'm just making sure everything is square, and look, it wasn't square. This doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. No one is going to know that it's not perfectly square, and for what I'm doing, this was good enough for me. So what I did do is I grabbed my random orbital sander with some 80 grit sandpaper and just sanded the edges flush, because when you do use a jigsaw you can get little stray bits of pine or little bits of wood, and they can stick out. This just ensures that your outside edge is nice and even and nice and smooth. Again, just using my set square there to see that I've got the edges all nice and straight, and they were. And now I'm using another length of wood, and the easiest way to do this is to press it up against the back edge of your frame and go from underneath and make a marking, and that is going to be the perfect length for the inside cross brace of the panel. And you can see it fits in there nice and snug, and then you just secure that with some staples as well. Very easy, and the best thing to do is to measure the center of your frame, and then from there measure whatever width of wood you're using to make your frame, divide it by half, and then measure either side. So basically you're aligning the piece of wood with the center of your frame. The other way you can do that is mark the center of the cross brace and line that up with the center of the edges. Now what I did there is I marked front or back, whichever one I wrote down, and that is so I know which side is going to face the board. There's always a good side and a bad side. Make sure you pick which one's which. And for this piece I chose a 3mm thick piece of plywood. You could use MDF, you could use whatever wood you prefer for your panels. Birch often works really well. And now I have my track saw ready to go. We're going to cut this length of wood off. This is the waste section. A track saw is ideal for this because it will cut in a nice straight line, and you just want to set the depth of your track saw to just below the depth of your piece of wood. Now I can never remember which stopper is the right depth on my one, so it's 3mm plus the depth of the wood. Yours will be different, and the reason we've done it this way is I have purposely kept the plywood larger than the frame. Reason being, when I did this last time, I made the plywood first. I cut that out first and tried to make the frame to fit, and it was much more difficult. I did several different little chop cuts to try and get things fitting, whereas this way I can leave it a little bit oversized and use my trim router to go around the outside and trim off any of that excess wood. Now I've just got some wood glue here. Doesn't matter which brand you use. This one's a Shelee's one, I believe. If you want that to stay nice and put, use Titebond 3. That's what the woodworkers use for furniture and things like that. You don't have to, just basic wood glue will do the trick here. And I've just got a piece of paper towel that I'm using to wipe up all the excess paint. And now I'm putting some staples in all of the places where this wood is going to come up, and that's going to hold everything nice and tight while it dries, and that way I can use the trim router now without having to wait for that wood glue to dry. Now, like I said, if I was to do this again, which I definitely will, I will use pin nails because the holes are much easier to fill, and the staples did protrude a little bit from the top, but I'll show you how I fixed that. Well, attempted to fix it. It wasn't a perfect solution because I still had some holes, but we basically just fill those in with a bit of gap filler. So I'm just working my way around the edges, stapling everywhere that it's going to lift up, and that's going to hold it nice and tight so that the wood glue has a good amount of compression on it. So here you can see there's a staple that didn't go all the way in, and it's sticking out of the top, which is quite dangerous. Now I'm showing you the router bit that I'm using. It's called a flush trim router bit. If you've never used a router before, they can be very dangerous. They are probably the most dangerous weapon or a tool in a workshop because they can slip very easily and cause a lot of damage in a short amount of time. There are no safety cutoffs like table saws sometimes have, and they can be very difficult to use if you're unsure of how to use them. So the way a flush trim bit works is there is a bearing on the top and bottom of this one. You can get top mounted or bottom mounted ones. In this case I have both. And what that does is that bottom bearing is going to ride along the pine frame, and it's going to trim off all of the bits on the top so that they are perfectly flush. Whenever you're doing woodworking, especially with a router, always wearing gloves and mask. And using a router, the router bit, when it's facing downwards like I'm using now, spins clockwise, and the way that you go when you're routing something like this is the opposite direction to the spin direction. So in this case I'm working my way counterclockwise around my workpiece. There was a screw here in this template, so this is a router jig from 3x3 Customs in the States. Really nifty little jig, just gives you a little bit more control and fidelity when using your router. And the screw was just sticking out a little bit, so it was gouging into the wood, but we can fix that with some gap filler. So taking it really slowly, making sure that the cable is out of the way so that the router does not get caught on the cable. And it was getting caught on something and I couldn't figure out what it was. It was that staple that was sticking out. So just be sure that if you're doing any of this, always make sure everything is nice and flush, and I do go back later and fix everything by using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer, just to hammer those staples firmly underneath the surface of the wood. So this entire process only took about an hour, so it doesn't take long to make yourself a wooden frame. And that's it. That includes drying time of the wood filler and everything. Obviously you can leave it a little bit longer if you're drying your wood glue overnight, or if you're waiting for that to dry naturally. You could do all sorts of things. You would just clamp that down. And now I'm going around with my orbital sander, and I've got 120 grit sandpaper on this, and I'm sanding over the entire surface wherever there are staples protruding out, sanding the edges to make sure that they're nice and flush and nice and smooth. So now I'm clamping that down again, just so it's not moving anywhere, grabbing the hammer and the screwdriver and just hammering those in. So you can see it's not a hard process. I did learn a fair bit along the way, and the reason that I don't have the actual audio for this, where I was telling you how to do everything like live, is because my dad had the air compressor on in the background, and it is much louder than it seems. So even though it was a couple of 100 meters away, it was still very loud, and I could not remove the noise from that sound. So now I'm just wedging the screwdriver under there and using a pair of pliers to pull out that staple that went rogue, hammering down everything else, and then I'll give it a sand again. So once I've done this, I'm going to move my electrical cable out of the way. Always work in a clutter-free environment so you don't trip. And this is the multi-fill compound I'll be using. It's paintable and it's white. And I've just got a little scraper that I've had in my paint arsenal for a little while. And sorry about the wobbly of the camera. I was just trying to change angle. And here I'm just filling the gaps. You want to leave it a little bit proud of the surface. Don't try and scrape everything off to flatten it out. It's better to leave it proud so that you can sand it flat. So just going along and filling all of those little holes. And if you see anything that's raised, if you see anything that's still sunk that needs to be filled, this is where I filled the big cracks in the side that were made with the screw from the router jig. So I just smeared that all on. You can't see that, that's off screen at the moment. And this stuff takes about an hour or two to dry. You can speed it up using a heat gun. I didn't find that it was very effective though, because the holes were, like if it was just a surface coat, wouldn't be too much of a problem. But because the holes were a little deeper, the inside of the hole didn't cure as quickly as the outside. So now it's time to give this a good sand, get all of that multi-fill off, and we will have a usable paintable panel that we made ourselves. It looks really professional, it's much more sturdy, greater for resin, and it just gives a better finish than a canvas in my opinion. That'll do it for this video, guys. We've made our own wooden panel. Don't forget, if you like what I'm doing here, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.